Thanks for joining us. I hope you're having a great time at Lync. I know it's been a great event for me, so hope you're all enjoying yourselves. My name is Mike Taylor, and I'm the CTO for Strategic Products and Services, SPS. This is Joe Segatola-Salami, so we're going to split this up. I'll do some of the first half, and Joe will do the back end of it, but here's some contact information. It'll be in the deck later if you need it for either of us. And what we're going to talk about today is a little bit about integrating or putting the puzzle pieces together when you're thinking about Lync plus an existing voice solution or some existing video assets that you may have today. And I'm going to cover some of the upfront, what are the issues, what's the problem, what's the methodology piece, and then Joe's going to tackle the integration methods part of it since he's had more of the field expertise in that kind of stuff. But just a quick 2 seconds. For those of you that don't know SPS, Strategic Products and Services, we think of ourselves as a UC systems integrator. So we've got 25, 30 plus years of voice experience. A couple of years ago, we acquired a company called Providia, which was one of the biggest video integrators in the country. Did a lot on the video space. And obviously, we've got a fully developed Lync practice, including UC Master. So, what we like to be able to do is handle the end-to-end piece of it, including the network elements, everything. So we just thought we would be able to bring some insight into what we've seen and what approach we've used to help tackle some of those issues, hopefully provide some insights to you in the process of doing that. So one of the first things that we face all the time is that when you start looking at this whole piece of technology, there are risks and challenges associated with it. And one of the things that we've seen early on is just because you build it doesn't mean people are going to use it. So there are a lot of different technologies out there competing for people's attention and time and what they use and how they utilize it. Some add productivity to the business, some potentially detract or deter from them. And to get something that becomes a unified strategy across the business is a challenge to say the least, but it also requires some things like a cultural change in the business and breaking down some of the silos and think about this in a different perspective than we have for other things in the voice and video arenas before. So hopefully we can add some light to that situation and help you think about it in a different perspective. So first, the real big issue is defining this all within the context of your business, because really this is a very strategic decision. In fact, if you look at this like an enterprise application decision, there's a lot of commonality. It's very, very similar. You have to understand what the business needs and requirements are. How will this solve business problems or create some benefits from a use case or a productivity perspective within your business? Within that, what are each of the different user requirements? You'll see that different groups of people have different needs, different capabilities, and that certainly becomes an important part of the understanding when you want to get to what the overall beneficial piece of it is. And then what are the technical requirements? Is your network ready? Do you have the security pieces? What are there compliance issues? Other things like that. And then once you have all those pieces together, hopefully you map it to some specific goals or objectives, because in the end of the day, what you want to be able to do is track it and get some analytics around what have we accomplished? Is it meeting the goals and objectives that we originally set? And is it accomplishing what we hope to accomplish for the business? But understanding up front what those business processes are, what you really need to do is look at what technology does today, look at how communications can potentially enable or better serve those business processes, and where are those gaps in your business. And then we can look at which technologies help adopt those things, and we'll talk a little bit more about it.
One thing I'll just add on that point is, typically in the past when you thought about deploying a communication service, it was, I'm going to put a phone on your desk, and it really is that simple. It's a phone, it works, and I don't care how you're going to use it necessarily, but I give you a phone. And when you think about UC and all the different elements that touches of a business, that's when you really start to understand that things change. Because IM, presence, video communications, all of these things are much more tailored to a user. And some of it's driven by the consumer space as opposed to there's just a phone on your desk.
Yeah, and behind the scenes, there's all kinds of things that we didn't think about that you need to think about. So, the idea of getting rid of the phone on the desk and going purely to the PC is certainly appealing, But underlying that, you have to think about things like E911 and other pieces of the puzzle that may have implications on what kind of decision you make. So it's an important part of the overall process. So a key part of this is identifying the stakeholders in your business that have an interest in this or that are going to have an impact on the overall decision, and how, when you get this all done, unified communications will embed itself in your workflows and really change the nature of the way people operate within your business today. We've seen it with IM, and when IM came into the business, all of a sudden you can look at email utilization, and we've seen that over the last couple of years, utilization is decreasing somewhat. Certainly voice messaging, we've seen that go considerably down with the advent of more adoption of email and IM. So it really has an impact in technology overall and the way that your people do business. But within the business, look at certainly people within the line of business that have an interest in how this impacts the way that they operate on a day-to-day basis. The network people within your IT organization are going to care because, not only does video, particularly HD video, have a big impact on your network environment and what it does, but things like screen sharing, a lot of people don't know. A lot of it depends on the size of the monitor that you're using. So if you're using a very large screen monitor and you screen share, it can actually use more bandwidth on the network than a HD video call. So you need to think about those use cases, think about the utilization, and make sure your network is designed to support it. And usually the weak link in the network winds up being the WAN connections between your sites. So think about what kind of traffic we're trying to put over those connections, how we need to care for it, quality of service, all those other things. And there's certainly the applications within it and the security implications around it, particularly when you start thinking like BYOD or people bringing in tablets into the environment and putting this all over Wi-Fi. Most of our Wi-Fi environments were not designed or originally implemented to support all of this capability. So we need to care for all of those things in the process of doing it.
And the reason why this whole process is really important is because ultimately we're going to finish up the conversation today with a discussion of how you integrate voice and video environments that you may have today with your Lync deployment. And integration for integration's sake, I would argue, is potentially very dangerous. Understanding how the users will use it and then mapping those particular use cases to something that you as an IT organization or as a business can support is really going to be a very foundational underpinning. So if you just say, oh, well, we got to integrate it because that seems like the thing to do, this really, the thinking is start with how it's going to be used, how it's going to have net positive impacts for the business. And if you start there, then you can generally get down the path quicker and have a much better solution at the end of the day.
Absolutely. And when we walk into organizations today, what you see on the screen is not that untypical, right? There's different environments, and under this, you've got different user groups within the line of business. So, marketing, other areas within your business that really have needs and requirements around how they use this technology that are really potentially influencing the decisions, in a lot of cases driving the decisions. And then on the IT side, you've got network infrastructure piece, security piece. Often applications are separate and distinct from that, and a lot of the Microsoft environment has lived in that world versus some of the traditional voice environment. And what we've seen is, the important part of this task is really from the top down or from within leadership or from within the groups that are sponsoring this, try to get some alignment across what you're trying to do, because if you do it right, aligned incentives bridge, build the bridges across all these environments to really create a common set of goals, a common set of objectives, and really get the buy-in from all the different teams to help support a successful end result, right? Because if you've got competing concepts, ideas around what is the best end result within your organization, and you just go down the road of one of those, the odds of it really accomplishing what you want to accomplish in the end of the day are probably a lot slimmer than if you get the buy-in up front. So we've seen this as a key piece of the puzzle when we do it. And what I talked about before is identifying user needs. You can think about this in a lot of different ways. There's a lot of different approaches, but we put this up as kind of an example because what you'll see is you've got different groups within your business. So executives may have one set of needs, and what you can look is what's the group, who do they typically interact with, what are they trying to collaborate, how do they want to do that, and then what piece of the technology puzzle fits into that overall solution. And you can start to map the use cases by those different groups. And you may find you have 4 or 5 or 7 different use cases, whatever the number is. But what you start to do is map the different pieces of technology to the business needs and requirements of those people, and that helps you come out with an effective plan on what you want to roll out to whom, how to do the training, how to do the rest of the implementation piece, and assures a much greater level of success in the end of the day.
If you think about it from a financial perspective, one of the things that, if a CFO is looking at, okay, we're going to deploy a UC strategy, what's very important for them is to understand that they're getting maximum value for their dollars. They don't want to overspend on maybe a small group to be able to support that. So being able to divvy that up and then understand what really is going to be the cost to deliver a particular integration is going to be an important aspect of that as you build the business case.
Well, and the other important thing is identifying the use cases and mapping it back to those business processes. Hopefully what you can show through this is a significant ROI to the business that helps justify what it is you're trying to do and why you're trying to do it. So this really helps through that process as well. And then this piece is really to show that regardless of how we think of it, there's a lot of complexity to this, right? There's the outside elements of the network that go to it. There's your internal, the routing, VPNs, gateways, firewalls, your WAN infrastructure, your LAN infrastructure, and quality of service for voice and video is critical, and having it deployed properly is critical. And then you think about, if I've got X amount of WAN bandwidth from site A to site B, how much video traffic do I want to allow to occur over that at any given point in time? So you can set up call admission control or other things to help define that so you're not impacting other business applications as you're doing this. So you think about the platforms, you have to think about the collaboration applications, the infrastructure, the network that they all ride on, and then the functions. What are the features and capabilities that we're looking for? That gets to be important to make sure that we have the right kind of licensing mapped to those use cases that we were talking about before, so that we've cared for that in the overall design and planning. And then in the end of the day, what kinds of devices, right? Am I going to be able to deliver the kinds of features and capabilities that the community is looking for on the right types of devices? And the important part of this whole slide is just to help give you some overall scope to think about what are the elements, what are the things that we need to consider as we go through this whole process to come up with an effective strategy. And once you do that, one of the key things that we've seen is coming up with some kind of an adoption plan. We do this on the video side all the time. How many of you have like stranded video assets out there because somebody bought it, put it in the corner, and it got hard to use, and it's sitting there collecting dust because nobody knows how to use it, or you have to have a dedicated IT person come in and just support a conference call. But if you do the right kind of user adoption plan and think about the use cases, how it needs to be used, what's the feature functionality, what's the interaction like, and design the right kind of application set around that, then you can create the right kind of rollout plan. You get some control groups to build excitement around it, get some help from some super users within those communities to help understand what are the features and functions that they need to use to do their job right. And then you can go through a tweaking process to understand how we're getting this right and improving it, seeing the end results and the reality. And a big part of this is tracking the usage, right? Who's doing it? Who's actually on the applications? Are we accomplishing the things that we need to accomplish? And then make the changes as necessary. Because in the end of the day, if you have the right kind of adoption plan, if you're tracking it and you're doing the right kind of tweaking, we're meeting the needs of all those different user communities within the organization, and you have a much higher likelihood of success at the end of the day. Does that make sense?
And if you consider an example where maybe you roll out, say, Lync video to everyone, but you don't have the network bandwidth to really support it, whether that's internet or your MPLS or what have you, you could face a situation where users will abandon it because the experience is poor, and that is really a big problem. So understanding how you're going to roll that out into your organization, including all of the work on the back end that you have to do, is going to be very important, because the last thing we want to see happen is a great new technology comes out, people are find it difficult to use, or the quality is poor for whatever reason. The users don't care that it was the network guys that did it. They just care that the experience was poor. And so from their perspective, putting yourself in their shoes will be very important in terms of driving adoption overall.
And if you think about what Joe just said, it's really an important part of what we were saying before in the conversation. If I understand the needs of my user groups and who really needs video and who may not, you can roll it out to right groups within the population of your community, manage and control the bandwidth that's being utilized at first, see how the network adapts and what the requirements are, and then start to leverage it to people who don't. What we've seen in the past that's been a mammoth issue is somebody just says, oh, we got it, turn it on, and roll it out to everybody. And if they haven't checked the network, they haven't prepared, we've seen disastrous results around those kinds of things. So if you don't think about it, if you don't do the planning up front, if you don't care for those things, the end result might not be what you expect, and you won't have the kind of success and adoption that you have to have. And the other part of that is also thinking about the support model, right? A lot of this technology is relatively new to us, and certainly, we all have people within our organizations that have Microsoft skills, but do they have all of the right skills? And then the network careabouts are different than some of the other things that we've dealt with before, particularly if we start putting a lot of video on the network. So sometimes what we see is that not all of the organizations are prepared to support all of this day one. So an important part of the planning process is do a realistic evaluation of your network, your environment, your support staff, what you have, what you don't have. And to be perfectly honest, it's got to be a really thorough and honest inward-looking assessment, because if you just gloss over things or you take things at face value and don't do the right assessment, you're making decisions and implementing things based on misinformation, which can lead to some pretty poor results at the end of the day. So sometimes it's helpful to get a third-party perspective on this, because if you're worried that your teams internally aren't going to give you an open assessment of what they have or what they need to do, that's great. Sometimes people don't know what they don't know. So you've got to get some third-party opinions to help through that piece of it. But the important part is really understand the environment, think about what you need to support it, and build the support model into your planning process so that you've budgeted for it, you've cared for it, you know what the process is. Because as Joe was saying before, if video rollout has a negative impact, think about an outage, right? If you roll this out and you don't have the support model in place, and you have significant outage or multiple significant outages, and of course they always come at the wrong time, users' perception is that it's not stable, it's not supportable, and this isn't what we want to have. That can lead to, relatively poor adoption, and that's not the end objective, right? So the important point is thinking about all these things up front, making sure you build the right model, build the right plan, and if you care for it up front, you're less likely to have these kinds of issues.
And one thing that I just wanted to add on that point, this is, I think, an interesting exercise for everyone to undertake within their own organizations. From my experience in the field, some companies, though it is a little bit of a rarity, have a good handle on it, which is to understand and model how much it actually costs you to service a support ticket internally for any particular application. And that can probably help you determine what is the financial underpinning of any particular deployment. So, what does it really cost me on an ongoing basis in terms of people, hours, lost productivity, and all that sort of stuff? That, not a lot of people have gotten to that point with the way that they track their IT systems, but it's a very interesting exercise to try to undertake. So I'd encourage you to, when you go back to your companies, to think about how you might start to look at that. And that it also folds into, okay, we're going to do integrations. When you do integrations, and perhaps you've got different teams that are supporting your traditional voice or video infrastructure versus Lync, then you have to have a broader model to account for what really takes on that. And you've got different resources that don't necessarily report into the same organizations that may elongate the time it takes to service a ticket. So just one thing that I think is a little bit of interesting food for thought for you guys.
Thanks, Joe. So, in conclusion on this part, and then I'll hand it over to Joe, it's all about the planning. If you do the right planning up front, you have a much greater chance of success in the end of the day. And if you engage all the right teams and all the right people, you get buy-in across all those silos in our organization. You're all marching towards the same objective. You all have the same end goal in mind, and people are aligned around what you're trying to do. That's a great model versus, different parts of the organization having different ideas of what to do and how to get there, and trying to come up with some end result that in the end of the day won't meet the objectives. So do the planning up front. A lot of times a partner can help in this process, whether it's a skills requirement or just that third set of eyes outside your organization that can give a fresh perspective on what it is and what you need to do. Certainly some best practices pieces of the puzzle that come in there. Include some of the key user groups up front. When you define those user needs and requirements in those use cases, get some super users in those groups to help you define what the feature functionality should look like, how they use it, what they need to do. That gets you some better ideas around the requirements, helps you map the right things to the process and deploy the right pieces of it. Then do the honest assessment of your infrastructure, have all the day 2 support plans in place. If you know what you're doing from your network perspective, you get some general concepts of how much bandwidth you're going to use for video and traffic and other things. And honestly, not all of us know day 1 because we don't know what adoption is going to be like. But you have to make some assumptions and some guesses and involve people in the process. And if you do that, you're much further down the road to a successful implementation than if you just leave it all to chance. So that's our perspective on the upfront process. And then Joe's going to take you down the road now of talking a little bit more about if we do want to integrate, what are some of the options and models around that piece of it.
Okay, so this is going to be a little bit more technical in nature, but I think that the initial conversation that we had around how do you plan for this is important because, again, integration for integration's sake is a dangerous concept. And so we're going to try to leave at least 5-10 minutes at the end for questions, and good questions may win themselves a set of Skype minutes. So hopefully you're thinking of some good ones.
And if you remember how to say Joe's last name properly, that's probably good for you.
If you can spell it at the end of it, then you get 2 cards. So when we think about integration, and this is true of pretty much any communication system, whether it's Microsoft or any of the other vendors out there, there's many methods that are available, and you'll see, maybe a certain vendor prefers one over another for any number of reasons. But really, what they are all trying to do is rationalize and normalize on signaling and then media. And so, in signaling, in the case of Lync and most modern solutions, is SIP and the concept of session management. And from a media perspective, it depends on whether you're talking voice or video or desktop sharing. Those all have different protocols that they use for the media itself. But in any case, you can't simply rely on the fact that both systems, say, support SIP. They may not have common codecs between them. So you must account for both whenever you're doing an integration between these types of systems. And so we've got a nice little diagram of just kind of some general SIP infrastructure, and some of the messages get sent back and forth. And so if we want to consider some of the codecs, and this I think is important to think about, here we've got listed a few different voice, video, and content codecs that you may see. And so one of the things you'll notice if you were ever to try to do an integration between, say, a traditional VTC system and Lync is that content might not be shared back and forth. That was something that the traditional content of the video codecs, it doesn't use RDP, it uses something else. And so to that end, to be able to get content within a Lync to traditional VTC environment, you have to actually think about that and have something that sits in the middle that is going to convert between those two. And the same is true of audio, video, et cetera.
And an important point when we were talking about the design process, one thing that we've seen really invaluable is as you're building the design and you start to put a Visio together, put all these protocols and ports and everything else on the design, because when you sit that down and sit it in front of your security group and they look at this and say, oh, you're trying to use this protocol out, forget it. At least you can have that conversation up front, not at the point of deployment where all of a sudden it becomes a problem. So if you do the designs, map the protocols and the ports and everything on the design, it's a very helpful part of the process. Yeah.
And so, just as an example, when we look at the voice codecs, most PBXs that you'll have in your environment will support G711 and 729 and maybe 722 in terms of audio codecs. They don't support real-time audio, RTA, out of the box. So Lync mediation supports a conversion from RTA to G711 as example, but if you were doing wideband or trying to do wideband across that link, you'd probably run some issues there in terms of the overall integration. So just kind of keep that in mind when we think about the codecs. And SIP has some similar issues here because everyone says, and this is a classic example in the communication space or even in technology in general, which is I am standards-based. And to be based on standards is one thing, but to be based on something does not necessarily mean it's 100% compatible. So the fact that Avaya SIP is different than Cisco SIP, is different than AT&T or Verizon SIP, is different than Microsoft SIP. That is just the name of the game. So the RFCs have gone out, and that's kind of the base standard. that everyone, minimum set of features, but then everyone says, okay, that minimum set of features is great, but I want to do more with my product, and that is very much within their rights. And so each of them have made their own different extensions to the protocol, and when we have to account for those extensions, that's when things get a little bit tricky. So if I was to just send something as simple as an audio call between two systems, maybe that level of signaling is straightforward, but when I start to get into the more advanced features or wondering about very specific to a product type functions, that's when the extensions come into play and those messages simply get lost. And so when we think about integration, this is true of voice and video on the whole, and content to a lesser extent, but really there's three main methodologies. And so number one is to take over that signaling from one system, and examples within the Avaya and the Cisco world are the ACA client and cookie link, and we'll talk specifically about what those do, some of the pros and cons potentially, and really when you should think about using those versus not. The other is to share signaling in media, and so for example, I could have video units directly register to Lync as endpoints, and so I'm just basically, I've adopted those extensions, or another example is remote call control. And that has its own sort of foibles to it, but that is basically an area where a phone system is sharing signaling with Lync. They're kind of agreeing on a common methodology for communicating and sharing that information. And then the other is normalizing, and this is probably the most popular one that we see in the field, which is being able to simply create trunks or put gateways or federation type environments in place between two environments such that they're speaking the same language at a particular point, and then from there it flows out back into their own particular standards-based environments. So we'll go through all three of these, particularly for voice and video. So if we think about client plugins, this is taking over the signaling in media. The way that this typically works in the Lync world is that it's something that gets installed on the desktop. It uses the Microsoft APIs for Lync and Windows to alter the behavior of the client. So that may be putting in a different phone call button, maybe adding a bar to the bottom. It may be when you click something in Lync that launches a client that does something else. It depends on the manufacturers, and most of them have different ways of doing it. An important thing to consider is what the user experience becomes and really what you want to use Lync for. So if you've gone through the methodology that we talked about before to define that you're going to be using Lync for desktop video as an example, this could potentially be a showstopper for you. You wouldn't want to go down this road. And so it's important to kind of consider what are really the use cases and how people are going to use things. Typically, it will disable that peer-to-peer functionality of Lync and really significantly impact how you do conferencing within Lync. So another major caution. Some of them can be re-enabled if you use the telephony mode registry setting from the old OCS days, which basically defines on the client level how they operate. Can they do IM only, or can they get full-blown EV? So we can re-enable that stuff generally, and what most people will say is we don't support that. But again, these client integrations are tricky because what you'll run into an issue is maybe the provider who's given you that client plugin will say, oh, well, we support you, but on the back end, Microsoft may say, hey, that's altered the behavior of the client, and that may create some other issues that we simply can't control. And so there's a very realistic situation where if you want to go down that road, there's just a buyer beware in terms of that, especially considering some of the advanced functionality that Lync brings as it relates to conferencing. So definitely we've seen some customers do a proof of concept with this type of environment and then slow it down once they realize the downstream impacts to the core Lync workloads.
Yeah, and this type of thing is a great exercise for a lab environment. Right?
Yes.
So if you have or you can develop a lab environment to try some of these integration methodologies, it'll give you a much better idea of what the end result looks like in your environment.
Yeah, and so here's just a view, a high level. I won't spend a lot of time going through these of some of the major manufacturers that are what the integration is. And really, if you think about where can I share signaling between, say, my traditional voice system or video system and Lync. In these environments, this is happening on the desktop. So the desktop is the point of connection between both environments. This creates concerns about, if we think about how you access Lync over the internet through Edge, do you have that same methodology available to you on your voice side or your video side for your traditional environments? So a lot of concerns as it relates to access there as well. And here's how generally they look. They'll, for example, here we've got the Avaya plugin, which is actually just putting the call bar, moving it over in terms of where the button is. So if you've got a mix of environments and maybe people move back and forth, that may be a concern. And one other thing I wanted to mention is that I said before that these use the Windows desktop and Lync client APIs. What that implies, and I didn't say it explicitly, but I will now, is that means this is a Windows PC only type of environment. So if you've got Lync mobile users, you've got users on Mac, these generally are not available. So that's something very important to consider, especially as people become more mobile, start to use more mobile devices. Understanding what physical thing they're going to access this infrastructure from is an important consideration. So remote call control are really sharing signaling and media between environments. And so from a voice perspective, remote call control is something that Microsoft developed quite a while ago. And you'll see the last bullet point here, which is that the future of it is murky. We don't really know where that's going. No development has been done on it really since OCS. But it is a server integration between a particular CTI server and on the PBX side, it says via AES here, but it could be in the Cisco World Cups, or there's some other environments depending on what you've got in terms of a voice system, and the Lync front ends. And you actually define a user as a remote call control user, and that can be done, they're remote call control only, or alternatively that they are remote call control plus peer-to-peer, so I could still make Lync calls for voice and video if I wanted to. Can escalate between the two, but that is a limitation you kind of have to live with, and that's just the way that it works. And what it'll allow you to do is launch a click-to-dial from a Lync phone from a Lync client to a PBX phone. It doesn't work on Mac, really. It's weird. It'll pop up a call bar on a Mac if you make a call from your PBX phone, but it will not allow you to initiate a call. So just kind of a weird thing that exists within the Mac client specifically. But within Windows, it's pretty full functional, works as intended. Another thing that's interesting is if you consider the use cases that you're going to have for this, with RCC, it's kind of very incumbent upon the user to be physically next to a PBX phone. So as an example, if I have my PBX phone logged in back in New Jersey at my office, and I'm out here, and I click to dial, and I'm an RCC user, that phone will go on speakerphone and start to call someone, and I have no idea. Maybe the people who sit in the cubes next to me are just saying, who the hell is making that call? So, potential issues there in terms of user training where you really have to communicate to them that that's how it's going to work if you're going to go down that road. And it's something that is difficult, especially if people are not necessarily technology savvy. So if you're to give this to, say, an HR person or a marketing person that does not really use technology in that way often, it just might go right over their heads, unfortunately. So that's another thing to consider when you think about RCC. And here's kind of how that looks in terms of the overall protocols and communication. And so these SBCs up here, these could be the same SBC between that PBX and Lync. And what it'll do is basically have a CTI element sitting in between there. The Lync user is connected to Lync to the front end, and they're also configured for RCC. So when they click something, and they click the phone number as opposed to Lync call, which is really going to do a SIP URI dial, when they click that phone number within Lync, it will signal and say, hey, send this call over to the PBX to actually launch. And so the media is actually strictly being controlled by the PBX itself. You'll get a little call control bar, which is really just SIP signaling being shared back and forth. And here's how it looks. I mentioned before you can have RCC only, or you can have RCC, and that one, it was with peer-to-peer. And also, this is what it looks like in terms of the actual call bar. So that's me calling our main number, and you can get basic functionality, transfer, conference, hold, and do DTMF digits, but that's about it. You get no advanced functionality in that regard. And certainly, if you wanted to do drag-and-drop conferencing, things like that, also not supported. So really understanding what are really the limitations, the pros, the cons, what are your existing assets is really going to drive you to say, yes, this makes sense for us. No, it doesn't. And it is configured on a per-user basis. So you could have a mix of users. Maybe you've got very desk-bound, very people who are in the office all the time. Maybe they don't even have PCs that they take home. Maybe this works for them but wouldn't work for your mobile sales force because of some of those limitations. So,
yeah, and an important part of this, and this goes back to the design phase, understanding the user groups, understanding the needs and requirements, because it also has implication on the Microsoft licensing side.
Yep.
So making sure you've got the right licensing to do what you need to do for those groups of people.
It's actually a good point. So RCC requires the plus cal from a Microsoft perspective. So you kind of have to, and we talked about before, too many technologies. Really the key element to me that I can consider when I think about I've got a lot of different technologies is how much overlap is there? What's the cost of paying for it twice? And to that end, trying to do a financial rationalization of how you're going to do this as well as that technological use case one is going to be important. And then the third method for voice integration is really SIP trunking or normalizing between them. And this can be done in any number of different ways. If you've got an old PBX, that's old iron, that maybe only supports ISDN type connectivity, maybe you'll throw a gateway in there because Lync only speaks SIP from a signaling perspective. So really the use cases here is for dial-in conferencing. Maybe you want to have your PBX users be able to dial on net as opposed to go out and back in the PSTN into your conferencing environment. If you're using the PSTN connectivity through your PBX, this could be a good case to be able to bring in people from mobile phones or the outside world into that environment. Obviously, Lync EV, simultaneous ring is a common migration strategy and use case for our customers where they'll actually ring their PBX phone and Lync at the same time and then be able to pick it up in one or the other place, and then that gives them the option to say, okay, in maybe a year's time, we can start to migrate away from that PBX. And then obviously Exchange So if you wanted to do voicemail, and this doesn't necessarily require Lync, you could do voicemail from an Exchange perspective using 10 or 13 and actually have that connected right back to your PBX using SIP. So that's another common one we see as kind of a migration strategy for customers. It's to move voicemail over first as a part of an Exchange upgrade or migration, and then start to think about how they deploy UC. So depending on what your budgets are and your timelines and everything like that, that'll really dictate how that goes. But there's all sets of use cases. And so the way that it really works is this is a server integration again, so it's nothing really happening special on the client side. And so you'll be SIP trunking from your phone system or potentially your video system, we'll get to video in a second, to your Lync mediation servers. And that's going to be the point within the Lync environment when you're actually doing that codec conversion, maybe to go back to a legacy like RTA client or something like that. Session border controller could sit in the middle, or you could have a TDM to SIP gateway, as I mentioned, if you need to be able to convert from, say, ISDN, PRI type connectivity for your legacy systems out to the SIP-supported variants of Lync. And again, we've covered the use cases. And here's potentially what this looks like. And so you'll see we've got our front end, which is obviously talking to mediation. This could be separate, could be the same. Lync 13 kind of consolidated a lot of those roles and how you might deploy it. And what I've got here is this PBX SIP proxy. This could, in fact, be a PRI type gateway, which converts to SIP, or it could be a session border controller. So, this whole section here is a bit you can kind of switch them out depending on what your environment is like, what some of the integration concerns may be. Most of the major manufacturers out there have what you'd call a certified or supportable integration for their SIP stack to communicate to the Lync mediation server. So, this sometimes if you've got kind of maybe an old ROLM or something like that that claims it supports SIP, you might want to throw an SBC in the middle because they can do things like header manipulation for some of the SIP messages to be able to support actual smooth communication. But in general, put something that speaks SIP in between and then be able to have them communicate back.
And a lot of times when we go through this conversation with customers, the first thought is, well, if I do that, I've got this device, and then in my in-game strategy, what do I do with it? Yeah. Typically, if it's an SBC or a gateway, we can reuse it, whether it's within trunking coming into the Lync environment or something that we might use for remote connectivity to other capabilities or devices that you have in the system. So with the right kind of planning, with the right kind of forethought, those things don't become stranded devices and really become a part of the long-term strategy.
And so that really is, it's relatively straightforward. It's as simple as I wanted to connect my two phone systems together maybe 10 years ago. Maybe I put an ISDN trunk in between them. It's the same concept here. Most of the major PBX manufacturers have a concept that they've used for simultaneous ringing to cell phones, where if you've got the PSTN trunks terminating on that on that PBX, you might use that method, and it's called like a remote destination in the Cisco world and an OPS in the Avaya world, where you'd actually use that to simultaneously ring. So what you get actually is a pretty nice user experience where the PBX is controlling the simultaneous ring to Lync, and then the user can control the simultaneous ring to their mobile phone from the Lync client, and they can do that from either the mobile client or the desktop client, so it actually allows them a little bit of flexibility. Whereas typically in the old PBX world, the ability to control the simultaneous ringing to a cell phone was an on or off discussion. They didn't get to change their number, they didn't get to really get that much in terms of actual access to that feature. Another thing that is, I'll gloss over it here in the sake of time, but a thing to consider is how you manage dial plans between these. So, are you using maybe 4 or 5 digits up here, and Lync is expecting E164? So considering that in your overall planning effort is going to be important as well, because it'd be useful if you could send that call and actually get it to the destination as opposed to just simply pushing it over. And another thing to consider is how you handle domains here. So the SIP domain of Lync may be different than the SIP domain of your PBX. And the way that you handle the SIP URIs for users on those two systems is another thing to consider in terms of the overall technical planning. And then finally, I wanted to mention presence here. So, obviously everyone wants to be able to do everything in this world. So there are different presence elements, typically a separate server that are delivered through most of the major manufacturers today. You may have invested in one, you may have not. And here's an interesting thing to consider, which is if you have a federation going on between Lync and, say, that other presence system, the way that federation is generally viewed by any of these manufacturers, and this is kind of just an across-the-board thing, is that I'm federating with someone that's actually an external third party. There's going to be no overlap between System A and System B. And what we've had to caution customers on a lot of times, they don't really think about it until we start to have this conversation, is the fact that, well, I've got users that are on System A and B, and I want to make them look like the same user. The way that federation is just developed is that it's considered an external party. So if that's, I'm company.com and that's othercompany.com, then that's fine, and I can actually get presence just okay. But if I have a user that's on both systems, they will have two identities when I go to search for them in my buddy list, whether it's on the Lync side or any other side. So I could potentially be saying, I'm going to look up Joe at spscom.com and get his Lync presence just fine. Or but if I wanted to see what his PBX phone is doing, then I'd potentially have an issue where I'd have to type in the extension at pbx.company.com. And so that's another thing to consider, is that federation is really for those specific use cases where you don't have user overlap. Otherwise, you kind of end up with a bad user experience. And it's something that is difficult to explain away, is that, oh, sorry, that they just don't work that way. That's something that users don't want to suffer. And so we've talked about this a little bit, so I won't want to rehash it too greatly, but basically, and really, one thing I'll actually add to this, and I'll maybe flip back to this diagram, is that some session border controllers do a really good job of session management. So depending on what you have in place today, you may be able to actually do things like an AD dip to determine if a user has a Lync identity, and then have the SBC make that intelligent routing decision instead of doing the simultaneous ringing. So again, there's so many different ways to skin the cat. So making sure that you understand what you have in place today and how you might actually deploy that is going to be an important first step to determine, do I do a session management at the SBC level? Do I do it at the PBX level? You got to do it somewhere. So the question becomes, what's the cheapest, easiest, most manageable way for me to do it? This is, yes. So what we're well, actually, no, I should take that back. So in the case of Exchange which doesn't necessarily require Lync, I may be using Exchange as a voicemail, I have to have the Exchange cal enterprise to be able to do In the case of Lync, I can have either an enterprise or a plus cal. If I'm doing a simultaneous ring to a user, what I want is the plus cal, because then I'm going to be doing EV in the Lync world. If I am doing dial-in conferencing, which this architecture works for dial-in conferencing, now in 13, you only need the enterprise cal. So if you are just going to publish a number, or maybe several numbers that are here, join our Lync conferencing bridge from a phone, that would be when you just need the enterprise cal.
Good question.
And so we've covered this, and really the big benefit here is that you get the full Lync user experience in terms of being able to get the same use cases across Windows PCs, Macs, and mobile, and tablets without actually degrading any of the underlying functionality of Lync. One of the potential issues, we mentioned it before with presence, but it's true, is that if I pick up my PBX phone here and make a phone call, Lync is kind of unaware of that happening because it's not being included in the signaling path. So a potential issue there for most people, it shouldn't be too big of a deal. It's just a simple matter of ignoring the call when it comes in, or pushing it to voicemail and then calling them back. So I use this setup in my world today to be able to do a lot of the testing that I do to support customers. And to me, it works very well. But what do I know? I'm a technology guy, so maybe to another user, this wouldn't be so great. But personally speaking, I think this to be really the most effective way to integrate voice technology into the mix, especially because I get the full Lync meeting experience, the ability to do multi-party video all day long and without issue. And so for video integration, things are roughly the same. And really, we can think about there's really three major manufacturers in the video space. That's Polycom, Cisco, and to a much lesser extent, Lifesize. We're not going to talk significantly in this session about the Lync room system. I'll cover it off very briefly right now, and you probably can go downstairs and see the Polycom and the Crestron variants. Smart also has one as well. The big thing about the Lync room system is that it's just a Lync client running a specialized version of the software that's optimized for touch and a big monitor. So anything that you think about with Lync as it relates to video and the Lync Room system, it is just a Lync client. So it supports, H.264 SVC, all the standard Lync stuff, so it integrates very tightly. So when we think about integrating into traditional VTC worlds, really, one of the big things to consider is, okay, if I can bring any Lync client in, I can also bring a Lync Room system in. What's going to be the appropriate experience from a content perspective? That's really where things start to get a little tricky in video. And actually, one other thing I wanted to mention is we saw yesterday in the keynote that they had an announcement about how they're going to have an ability to natively integrate with Tandberg. And if we think about back to our codecs overview, what do those traditional Tandberg codecs support? It's H.263, which Lync 10 supports, but not 13 from a client perspective, and H.264 AVC. So really a fixed bit rate, fixed frame rate type of environment. So you can imagine what they're doing. Now, we don't know this for certain, but you can kind of start to think about when we talk about our methodology for understanding integration. They're going to be doing some signaling interop, and maybe that's SIP to H.323, which is what a lot of those legacy systems supported. And they're going to be doing some codec interop as well, where they're going to be converting their SVC codec in Lync over down to AVC for support on those systems. So we don't know, obviously, all the details, but certainly, from a methodology perspective, how you think about it, that's likely what they're doing.
And just going back to the why of some of this, obviously, if you go through the assessment process, part of it's going to be looking at the assets that you have in place. And depending upon what they are and where they are in their life cycle, you may make different decisions about what of those assets you want to retain and try to use in here versus, we want to go buy some Lync Room systems versus other things. So it gets back to that assessment phase, understanding what you have, understanding where they are in their life cycle, and understanding what you want to do and how you want to do it in the overall perspective.
What I'm very curious to see, which I don't think that they covered yesterday, was what is it going to cost? Because you could really map the price per port or the price per user out if you knew that. And that's going to be an interesting thing to consider if your environments do have something like a DMA or an RMX from a Polycom perspective, or a Cisco MCU and their infrastructure in there as well. What is that going to be cost comparative-wise? I'm very curious to see. So we'll have to stay tuned for that one, so hopefully we can find that out in short order. And so from a Polycom perspective, when we do these video integrations, really the preferred method is to use DMA, which is their SIP proxy and bridge aggregation product. And so they can actually sit in multiple MCUs behind their DMA. And so we define a SIP trunk. It gets created on the Lync front end as a trusted application pool. And then I can do SIP URI routing. And depending on how deep you go with it, you can actually get presence status for your virtual meeting rooms on the bridge as well, where I would then be able to type in my VMR at company.com within the Lync client, see the status, or I could even do this for codecs as well, and then be able to dial directly to them. And now, considering what your client is important. So in the 10 world, you were either doing 263, which was low def, or you were buying an RTV key in the case of the Polycom codecs themselves to be able to support the 10 codec natively. Alternatively, if you were using an RMX in a meet on the bridge type scenario, what that would allow you to do is actually they shipped it with RTV out the box, so you didn't actually have to go buy a separate codec. So it depends on what the use case is. Are you talking user to user, or is it user to bridge that you can consider? But basically, this is supposed to build. There we go. What you'd have is just that SIP trunk integration that would allow you to get that dialing between them. There's to be some dial plan work in terms of how SIP domains are handled, but that would really be at a high level how you do it. And so this is the meet on the bridge scenario, and this is just a further illustration of that. This is a diagram we put together as we were starting to develop this reference architecture for our customers, and it really starts to paint out all the different pictures of what you may have. So, considering external, video users, and there's Polycom infrastructure that would actually allow you to traverse the firewall in addition to your edge infrastructure, and then this really is happening within the internal network within the core DC. We talked a little bit before about the issues with content. Now, Polycom actually has a solution here. It's one that, the kind of the validity of it and the virtue of it, I think, is debatable, but it is one that is workable, which is that Lync uses RDP for its content sharing, and the Polycom world uses H.239, which is just kind of traditional. It's basically video, and so they have a server and a desktop plugin, and that plugin will determine whether or not you're in a Lync meeting or potentially in, say, a meet on the bridge type scenario, depending on how you've dialed and what your actual active experience is. And so what they'll allow you to do is then basically automatically, seamlessly to the end user, it'll do conversions of that RDP traffic if you're doing a meet on the bridge scenario. And this is an interesting thing to consider is if you just turned on content sharing, maybe from a room VTC system to Lync, they'd see it as a video stream most likely. So being able to account for that is an important thing if you're really trying to do these fully collaborative meetings and you've got traditional infrastructure, because content has become a big way of us working these days. So I'm sharing PowerPoints or going through how things are configured on my computer all the time, and if I can't share that to the room that I'm talking to, it's really diminishes the experience. They just get to look at my face as opposed to really what I'm trying to show them. And so this is the one that I talked about before, and it depends on the endpoints you have and whether you're using 13 versus 10 and a couple of other things like that. But they're going to be pretty soon finalizing certification of Lync and as supporting from a signaling registration perspective the actual Polycom endpoints themselves. And so in 10, it's been fully supported for a while, but 13, they're still working through some engineering kinks in terms of signaling. But basically what this allows you to do is your Polycom unit, as an example, is actually going to be registered to the Lync server, and it's going to have a Lync user ID and account. So you obviously have to provision it in AD and all that sort of good stuff. But we don't see a lot of customers go down this road. Typically, they're further along in their Polycom deployment, or they're considering on the flip side, maybe I go with Lync Room System because it's basically the same type of functionality, and then I've got a little bit tighter integration. So these are the things you have to kind of weigh against each other when you start to look at this type of integration. But it is fully supported by Polycom, and even Microsoft too. They've had a pretty good partnership for a few years now. And so this is showing some SIP trunk integration for Cisco, and they finally, I think now about maybe a month and a half ago, released their VCS 8.1, which allows you to be able to support Lync calling for 2013. So as we've talked about several times before, those traditional systems are supporting 263 or AVC, not RTV. And in the past, what Cisco had, and actually I think there's just a few different slides that depict the same thing, so I'm going to go with this one. In the past, what Cisco had is, okay, you want to bring RTV into our calls, meet on the bridge type scenario, that's great, but we need an advanced media gateways, or AMGW, to actually do that protocol conversion. Or you demote yourself to 263 low def. So if you wanted to do HD in this type of environment, you needed to buy this very expensive gateway. I forget what it was on a per port basis, but it was not cheap. And so now they're finally supporting SVC within that 8.1 integration. So the cost of doing it has gone way down. Again, as we think about what they announced yesterday morning, I'm very curious to see what the costing of this type of environment, if you don't already have it today, looks like relative to going with the Microsoft Pure solution. A lot of information we still got to dig in there. But if you have the VCS environments today, this may be something that's palatable to you because you can very simply hook it in and get people in. Again, it's meet on the bridge scenarios for Cisco, and within the Polycom world, we can do both meet on the bridge and direct registrations. I think that might be the end of my shtick. I talk really fast, so I think I've got actually a fair amount of spare time. So, any questions? Yes?
So, in both those scenarios, obviously, I do a SIP call to meet on the RMX bridge or the VCS bridge.
Yep.
Does it work the other way?
Having them join a Lync meeting?
Yeah.
No. Yeah, it does not. So you really don't.
How do you describe that to customers? Because obviously, Meet now is a huge sell.
Yep.
Do you
Just wanted to, for recording, if you could just repeat the question.
Oh, yeah, sorry. So the question was, how are users able of these traditional VTC systems able to join Lync meetings? And so the answer is no. And so you had a separate question you were going to follow on.
just kind of this is a common question, right up there with the shared presence of my call manager and Lync, and they want the world. This is the second big question of, well, I can't, my Cisco stuff in general, and like, well, you plan it and do a peer-to-peer if you really need that.
Yeah.
But it's not always the best story because a lot of times you already have 3 or 4 or 5 people in a meet now.
Yep.
And now you want to bring in a conference room or something that's got the CEO that's got a real.
Yeah, so you couldn't just drag and drop that room. Well, so in the Polycom, you can do that with a direct registration. But if you're doing something like Cisco where you don't have that direct registration option available to you, you're absolutely right. It's a problem within the overall market today. There are a couple companies that are developing solutions around that, but the thing you got to consider is feature overlap. So their solution is just a different conference bridge that does a better job of interop. So it's then you're thinking about, okay, now I've got a third conference bridge. So that's another thing to consider. Now, again, what we saw yesterday, and obviously there's a lot of details to be worked out, but what it appeared to me that they were doing was dragging and dropping a codec into a Lync meeting. So that, I think, is really designed to address that specific problem. So it's been supported on Polycom because we can do direct registration, and I think this bridges the gap for Cisco. I want to see a lot of the particulars.
Only work if you direct register on the Polycom side, or can I drag an RMX bridge into, people that are registered to the RMX?
Actually, no, I apologize. Yeah, you should be able to drag and drop someone that's front-ended by a DMA.
You can drag and drop the bridge to dial the bridge, but that's not going to escalate a single party call to multi-party. You're just meeting people on the bridge.
Sure, yeah, no,
So it's a little bit difference in the use
Just
case.
a codec itself, right? Yeah, I believe that should work. I'd have to verify within the documentation, but I'm pretty sure that would work. Yes?
Any awareness on the life size codecs as far as direct registration or?
Okay, so the question was around the what is the situation with life-size codecs and their ability to direct register? So back maybe now 3 years ago when Lifesize and Polycom both said, okay, we're going to stake our claim as being the companies that are going to really dive in deep with Lync, they both had both meet on the bridge and direct registration scenarios. What you'll notice if you look at Lifesize's marketing materials and their data sheets is they've completely wiped all references to that. So as best I can tell, they've simply just dropped the project. Theoretically, I guess if you got an older version of code, you might be able to make it work in a more supportable environment just because, who knows if they took things out or broke things. I don't think they've done anything in the 13 world, though.
Yeah,
so if you were to do it.
It's a great question. We can probably do some follow-up for you if it makes sense. So absolutely.
Just
Look into it.
Any
And there was a
other
question back here, too. Yes?
What's your experience with the plugins in the wild, especially as it kind of relates to redirecting all the traffic from whatever vendor server?
Yeah.
So repeat the question.
Yeah, so the question was, what's our experience with these plugins in the wild and potentially the impacts of it redirecting traffic from one place to another? Certainly, one impact that it has is actually the network planning that you have to do around Lync involves less. So it may be, you may have to plan for the ability to do a screen share from Lync in a peer-to-peer mode, because that still works on the Lync server, and that's bandwidth that's really controlled by Lync. But the audio conversations and potentially the video as well, depending on how it works, are then, the call admission control policies that you have to define are being defined on that, that existing environment. So it really just starts to split up the workloads of how you do things. And so, having the ability to actually converse between the team that's deploying Lync and the team that manages the existing system is going to be important, because you don't want to have a situation where it's okay, guys, we're going to start to route a lot more traffic to you from a video perspective because now we're driving video through that plugin, and you didn't define CAC policies for video.
Do you find any issue with the plugin itself? As far as seeing that out there deployed, if there's any traffic issues or anything else?
I mean, it's another piece of Windows software, so I would say that it's no worse than most of the other software that I have on my PC, at least. I've played around with them quite a bit. And I think initially when they came out, there were some quality issues, but those have largely been improved. The way that I look at it is really you have to determine what are the use cases and the existing infrastructure that could support them, and then do that gap analysis to find out what really is the cost of doing one versus the other.
And probably the thing that I'd add to that is around the user experience. So one of the big things that we've seen is if you take a typical Lync experience and try to translate that to the plugin, it's not always the same. So understanding what those differences are become an important part of whether or not it really, creates the end effect that you want to have.
Yeah. Like, are you going to support drag and drop conferencing, for example? Good use case.
That gets to be a big part of it.
Yes.
At what point do you break out a communication server?
It really depends on a number of different things, what the overall amount of traffic that we're trying to route through, and there's also potentially a network concern in terms of trying to just segregate that out. I don't know, it's been a while since I've done that level of detailed design on the actual mediation breakout. I forget, I think it's something in the order of 100 to 200.
It depends if you're using bypass or not.
Yeah, it really does, and to get, yeah. And there's other considerations to the point about bypass, which is, for example, some of those integrations for SIP trunks do support media bypass, which in the traditional PBX world is potentially called direct media, where I actively can speak the same codec between them, like 7-Eleven from client to client. that will require a lot less work on the mediation server than if I have to send everything through there and convert. It depends on what that phone system is and the release and all that sort of good stuff.
When you're doing the click to dial and you have a cell phone, do you still have to maintain that inside of AD, or does the user have more capabilities?
For simultaneous ring within the Lync client? Yeah, that's actually defined by the user. So when you log into Lync, you can there's a call forwarding section of settings at the very bottom of the client. When you first log in, it'll say call forwarding off. That doesn't need to be administered in AD. You can actually just go in there and turn that on or off. You can control that by a group policy if you want to say, I don't want you to have the ability to do simultaneous ring or call forwarding. So for example, you get some knucklehead that throws an international number in there and really starts to rack up phone bills for simultaneous ringing alone as a potential reason why you may look at certain types of policies for that. But generally speaking, they'll log in, they'll click the down arrow on that call forwarding bar, and then be able to put in whatever number they want. Typically, for most of the people in this room, a US-based cell phone.
You want to just repeat the question again?
Yeah, sorry, and just to kind of wrap it up for the recording, the question was around, how do we manage, from an infrastructure perspective, the ability for users to have simultaneous ring?
Anything else? Yes.
What version of Lync server supports the direct administration?
So it's actually both, but there's kind of this semantics question of supported versus kind of works. So officially supported today is 10. And I believe it's still on the roadmap. I don't think it's come out yet. I'd have to verify that. But there should be supporting actually, it's tricky. So it depends on what you've got. So for direct reg, if you've got HDXs, which are Polycom's legacy environment, they're not going to do any additional code work on that. But if you have the newer group series, they're going to make some changes to the code that'll fully support the 13 SVC experience. In the case of the HDXs, they're going to be using RTV or 263.
So does that mean that Microsoft bringing the VCS gateway into the Lync server environment?
Oh, so are you thinking about what they announced yesterday? Yeah, so VCS is the Cisco product. So if we think about that Tandberg interop that they used yesterday in the keynote, what they're likely going to have is some software element that's doing signaling and media conversion from 263 or 264 AVC, which to SVC, their implementation of it specifically, because there's different ways you can implement SVC. And they're also going to be doing the SIP normalization from a signaling perspective. And they don't need to do that on the Polycom side because they already work together to do that development up front.
And the question again was around what's supported for direct registration on 2010 versus 2015. Anything else?
Yeah, we got another 10 minutes or so, but I'm happy to let you guys go early. Yes?
Another question. The dial-in conferencing, is that the only thing voice-wise integration that you run on the enterprise voice-wise?
So the question is around
Enterprise Cal.
what can you run under Enterprise Cal versus running the Plus Cal? So you can handle part of it, but some of the plugins, depending upon the manufacturer, may work with the standard Cal without having to require the Plus Cal. So again, but you have to think about the feature functionality and what you're getting.
Yeah, so at a high level, if I'm doing a SIP trunk between my phone system and Lync, it's going to be in the enterprise world for dial-in, dial-out conferencing. So maybe we'll broaden it to include dial-out. And then anything beyond that is going to be an enterprise voice type workload, which is going to be the Plus Cal. So enterprise and up, which is, you wouldn't do it for a standard implementation because there would be no ability to support voice in that regard in terms of the standard Cal, but it would be, dial-in, dial-out conferencing at the enterprise level, and then the more true EV stuff at the Plus level. Yes?
You have your question on simmering and everything. What type of story are you telling your customers around the presence? Because, obviously RCC
Yeah. Yeah, who knows where it's, yeah.
We hope it goes away.
It's going somewhere.
I need to know that my operator knows the executives on the phone when they're on Lync, and it is a tough story. I mean, how do you guys kind of combat that?
Yeah, and I don't know if you. So the question, the question was around how do you deal with our particular customers the issue that comes up in the simultaneous ringing world when a user has, say, a Lync client with EV that does presence and then a PBX phone that is not sharing that presence back and forth. And the reality is that this gets back to segmenting your user group. So if there's an executive assistant, they're typically desk-bound. And so they may have a set of requirements that may push them towards the RCC or the plug-in type environment versus everyone else can get EV because they don't need to have that specific level of detail. The other thing...
Do you see doing implementations where it's kind of some people are RCC, some CPE?
Yep. Yeah, we see...
You kind of get somewhat best of both worlds?
Yeah, we do segment in that way, and it all gets back to, you know, what is going to be the best bang for your buck in terms of investment. And, you know, not everyone works the same. So the sales force that's very mobile is going to have different requirements than the people who sit in the office and maybe are working on spreadsheets.
And a lot of it gets to that user adoption conversation. So if you decide the use case, map the feature functionality, and create the right training plan for people to understand what they do and don't have and how they use it, I think you avoid a lot of the confusion. Sometimes what happens is we see somebody says, well, this is a good idea, I'll deploy it. They don't explain it or do the user adoption training, and then they create issues or problems. I think if you confront that up front, discuss it, understand what you're trying to accomplish, there's a lot less issue around it. I mean, we use it, we know what it does, we know how it works, so it doesn't become an issue.
Yeah, one thing that I'll add is, you know, when we talk about integration, we're talking about different manufacturers.
Right.
There is no perfect answer for every single user group all the time, unfortunately. It's just the world we live in. So managing expectations is going to be a big aspect of when you start to plan your deployment. And that's probably true of most actual information worker jobs, is, you know, managing that level of expectation so people don't expect that they're going to get the world and they only get one continent.
Anything else?
All right, well, you guys have been a great audience.
You've
I
been
really
a great
appreciate the
audience.
time.
Thanks a lot. We really appreciate it.